Most people imagine breaking the sound barrier as a dramatic, explosive moment, but inside a fighter jet, it feels far more controlled and far more technical. Pilots don't hear a boom themselves. Instead, they experience subtle changes in how the aircraft responds, how the air behaves, and how the instruments react. As the jet pushes through dense air at extreme velocity, pressure waves' drag characteristics change rapidly. You're accelerating past 700 miles per hour, and suddenly, everything changes in sensation, control, and the way the aircraft moves through the sky. Breaking the sound barrier is often imagined as a single dramatic event, a violent transition marked by noise and force, but in reality, it's a controlled and highly calculated phase of flight. In a modern fighter jet, the process of going supersonic is not about a sudden explosion of speed, but about gradually overcoming a complex set of aerodynamic conditions that exist as an aircraft approaches the speed of sound. To understand what it feels like, it's necessary to first understand what's actually happening to the air around the aircraft, and why this region of flight behaves so differently from both slower and faster speeds. At sea level, the speed of sound is approximately 1,235 kilometers per hour, although this value changes with altitude as air temperature decreases. As a fighter accelerates toward this threshold, it enters what is known as the transonic region, typically between Mach 0.8 and Mach 1.2. This is where airflow over different parts of the aircraft begins to behave unpredictably. Even before reaching Mach 1, some portions of the airflow are already moving faster than sound, particularly over curved surfaces like the wings and fuselage. These localized supersonic pockets create shock waves, which in turn generate a rapid increase in drag known as wave drag. From the pilot's perspective, this phase does not feel like a dramatic surge forward, but rather a resistance. The aircraft requires significant more thrust to continue accelerating, and engine power must be carefully managed. In older jets, especially early supersonic fighters, this region could feel unstable. Controls might become less responsive. Buffeting could occur as turbulent airflow disrupts smooth flight. Modern fighters, however, are designed to minimize these effects. Fly-by-wire systems automatically adjust control surfaces to maintain stability, meaning the pilot experiences far less physical disturbance than one might expect. Inside the cockpit, there's no audible indication that the aircraft is approaching the sound barrier. The jet itself is already moving faster than the sound waves it produces relative to the surrounding air, so any boom generated by the aircraft travels outward and behind, never reaching the pilot. Instead, the experience is dominated by instrumentation. The pilot monitors Mach number on the display, along with altitude, engine performance, and control inputs. The transition through Mach 1 is observed rather than felt in a dramatic sense. As the aircraft continues accelerating, the aerodynamic forces begin to shift. Control surfaces that behaved normally at subsonic speeds can respond differently as shock waves alter airflow patterns. This is one of the key differences between subsonic and supersonic flight. The center of pressure on the aircraft moves, and without proper design or control compensation, this could cause the nose to pitch unexpectedly. Modern fighter jets are engineered to account for these changes, often using canards, advanced wing designs, and computerized flight control systems to maintain stability throughout the transition. One of the most significant changes occurs in drag characteristics. In subsonic flight, drag increases relatively steadily with speed. Near Mach 1, however, drag rises sharply due to shockwave formation. This is why early aircraft struggled to break the sound barrier at all. It was not simply a matter of adding more power, but of designing airframes capable of handling these aerodynamic effects. Once the aircraft passes fully into supersonic flight, drag actually stabilizes again, allowing more efficient high-speed travel under the right conditions. From the pilot's perspective, the moment of passing Mach 1 is subtle. There's no jolt, sudden release, or dramatic visual cue. Instead, there's a slight sense that the aircraft has moved through a threshold where control becomes smoother again after the resistance of the transonic region. The acceleration may feel more consistent, and the aircraft's behavior becomes more predictable. This is often described by pilots as a transition from a complex, unstable regime into a more stable and controlled one. The sonic boom itself is one of the most misunderstood aspects of supersonic flight. It's not a one-time event that occurs exactly at Mach 1, but rather a continuous phenomenon generated whenever an object travels faster than sound. As the aircraft moves, it produces pressure waves that merge into a shock wave, forming a cone that extends behind it. When this cone intersects with the ground, it is heard as a sonic boom. For the pilot, however, this event is entirely external. There is no sound or physical sensation inside the cockpit associated with the boom. Visually, there can be subtle indicators of this transition under certain atmospheric conditions. At high humidity, shockwaves can cause condensation, forming a brief vapor cloud around the aircraft as it approaches transonic speeds. This effect is often captured in photographs and videos, giving the impression of a dramatic barrier being broken. In reality, it's simply the result of pressure changes in the air, and it's not always present. The cockpit environment itself remains relatively stable throughout the process. Modern fighter jets are designed to isolate the pilot from extreme external conditions, maintaining consistent pressure, temperature, and structural integrity. The forces experienced by the pilot are more closely related to acceleration and maneuvering than speed alone. In straight and level supersonic flight, the physical sensation can actually feel less intense than high G turns at lower speeds. Real pilot accounts often emphasize how anticlimactic the experience can seem to those expecting something more dramatic. Many describe it as simply watching the Mach meter pass 1.0 while the aircraft continues to accelerate smoothly. The complexity lies not in the sensation, but in the engineering and physics that make the transition possible. Pilots are trained to understand these factors in detail, ensuring they can manage the aircraft safely and effectively during all phases of flight. At higher altitudes, where air density is lower, breaking the sound barrier becomes easier. Reduced air resistance means less thrust is required to reach supersonic speeds, and the aerodynamic challenges of the transonic region are less severe. This is why most supersonic flight occurs at altitude rather than near the ground. It also reduces the impact of sonic booms on populated areas, as the shockwaves dissipate before reaching the surface. Despite the controlled nature of modern supersonic flight, the transition still represents a significant aerodynamic milestone. It marks the point at which the aircraft is no longer limited by the propagation speed of pressure waves in the air. Instead of pushing against air that can move out of the way ahead of it, the aircraft is effectively outrunning its own pressure signals, requiring entirely different aerodynamic considerations. In operational terms, breaking the sound barrier is not always necessary or desirable. Supersonic flight consumes significantly more fuel, and the benefits depend on the mission profile. Interceptors and air superiority fighters may use supersonic speeds to close distance quickly, while other aircraft prioritize efficiency and endurance. This balance between speed and practicality is a key factor in modern fighter design. Understanding what it feels like to break the sound barrier requires shifting focus away from dramatic imagery and toward the actual experience of controlled flight. It's not defined by a single moment of impact, but by a gradual transition through a complex aerodynamic environment. For the pilot, it's less about sensation and more about awareness and trust in the aircraft's systems. This distinction between expectation and reality is what makes the experience unique. It's not the explosive event often portrayed in the media, but a demonstration of how advanced engineering has transformed one of the most challenging barriers in aviation into a routine, manageable aspect of high-speed flight. Once a fighter jet is fully supersonic, the environment around it is no longer behaving in a way that aligns with everyday intuition. At this point, the aircraft is not simply moving through the air faster, it's fundamentally changing how pressure, sound, and airflow interact with its structure. The most important element of this phase is the formation of shockwaves, which define both the performance of the aircraft and the sonic boom heard on the ground. As the jet exceeds the speed of sound, pressure waves can no longer move ahead of it. Instead, they compress and merge into a cone-shaped shockwave that trails behind the aircraft. This is often referred to as the Mach cone. Everything inside this cone is affected by the sudden change in pressure, and when that cone reaches the ground, it's perceived as a sonic boom. Importantly, this is not a one-time event. As long as the aircraft remains supersonic, it continuously generates this shockwave. From the pilot's perspective, none of this is directly experienced through sound or vibration. The cockpit remains insulated, and there's no audible boom inside the aircraft. What the pilot is aware of, however, is how these pressure waves influence the aircraft's behavior. Airflow over the wings, control surfaces, and engine intakes is now being shaped by these high-speed pressure changes, and this has direct implications for stability and performance. One of the key areas affected is engine operation. At supersonic speeds, the air entering the engine must be slowed down to subsonic speeds before combustion can occur efficiently. This is managed through carefully designed air intakes that use shockwaves to compress and decelerate incoming air. If this process is disrupted, it can lead to a compressor stall, which is a serious event where airflow through the engine becomes unstable. Pilots are trained to monitor engine performance closely during supersonic flight, ensuring that airflow remains stable and within operational limits. Control characteristics also change in subtle but important ways. While modern fly-by-wire systems compensate for most aerodynamic shifts, the underlying physics still affects how the aircraft responds. Movements can feel more precise, but also less forgiving if limits are exceeded. The margin for error becomes smaller at higher speeds, and small control inputs can have larger effects over time due to the sheer velocity of the aircraft. Temperature is another factor that becomes increasingly significant. As speed increases, air friction causes heating along the leading edges of the aircraft, including the nose, wings, and intake surfaces. While this heating is managed through material design and engineering, it's an important consideration in sustained supersonic flight. Pilots monitor temperature limits to avoid structural stress, particularly during extended high-speed operations. Visibility and perception also change at these speeds. The outside world appears to move differently, not because the pilot sees the speed directly, but because distances close extremely quickly. Objects on the ground, other aircraft, and even weather systems approach and pass in a compressed time frame. This requires a higher level of situational awareness and anticipation. Decisions must be made earlier, and reactions must be more deliberate. Despite these changes, the aircraft itself often feels stable once fully established in supersonic flight. This is a contrast to the transonic region, where airflow instability creates resistance and unpredictability. Beyond Mach 1, the airflow becomes more consistent again, and the aircraft settles into a steady high-speed regime. For many pilots, this is where the jet feels most clean in its behavior, with fewer disturbances and a more direct relationship between input and response. When pilots describe breaking the sound barrier, their accounts tend to focus less on sensation and more on process. One of the earliest and most well-documented examples comes from Chuck Yeager, the first pilot to officially exceed the speed of sound in level flight during the Bell X-1 supersonic flight in 1947. Yeager described the moment not as an explosive event, but as a smooth transition. As the aircraft passed Mach 1, the buffeting and instability he had experienced in the transonic region suddenly disappeared. The ride became noticeably smoother, confirming that the real challenge was not supersonic flight itself, but getting through the turbulent barrier leading up to it. Modern fighter pilots echo this same experience. Pilots flying aircraft like the F-16 Fighting Falcon or F/A-18 Hornet often describe their first time going supersonic as surprisingly uneventful. Instead of a physical jolt or audible cue, they recall watching the Mach number on their display slowly increase until it crosses 1. At that moment, there was no dramatic change inside the cockpit. The aircraft continues accelerating, and the only clear indication is the instrument reading itself. One U.S. Air Force fighter pilot described the experience as more of a confirmation than a sensation. According to this account, the aircraft actually felt less turbulent after passing Mach 1, particularly compared to the slight shaking encountered just below it. The pilot emphasized that if you were not looking at the instruments, you might not even realize you had crossed into supersonic flight. Pilots who have flown high-performance aircraft like the F-15 Eagle often highlight how quickly events unfold at these speeds. One common observation is how rapidly distance compresses. Targets that appear far away can close in seconds, and navigation requires constant attention. The sensation is not one of raw speed in a physical sense, but one of time accelerating around you. Decisions have to be made earlier, and there's far less room for hesitation. Another recurring theme is the absence of the sonic boom from the pilot's perspective. Many first-time supersonic pilots expect to hear something when they cross Mach 1, but quickly realize that the boom is entirely external. One naval aviator flying the F/A-18 Super Hornet noted that the only way to confirm the boom is through external observers or instrumentation. Inside the cockpit, there's complete silence in that regard. There are also accounts that highlight how routine supersonic flight becomes with experience. Pilots flying intercept missions or high-speed training sorties may cross Mach 1 multiple times in a single flight. Over time, it becomes just another part of the flight envelope, rather than a significant event. The focus shifts entirely to mission objectives, fuel management, and maintaining situational awareness. Ultimately, breaking the sound barrier is a transition in aerodynamic behavior that is largely managed by the aircraft itself. The pilot's role is to monitor, understand, and control that process. The moment itself may feel unimportant, but it represents one of the most important thresholds in aviation.